Hello and welcome to Oakville Matters. Thanks to Cogeco TV, television that really looks into our community makes it possible for us to have this show to talk about the things that matter to the residents of Oakville. And today, to the wider audience of the region of Halton, of which Oakville is a very important part. Perhaps not as important a part as the other parts might think, but certainly in our mind we're fairly important. And with me today are three gentlemen who are going to help us talk about community safety and well-being plans. Now, each one's going to give you an idea of what one is, and I'm going to introduce each one and cue them to do that. So the first one is Alex Sarchuk, who is the Commissioner of Community and Social Services for the region of Halton. And Alex, I'd ask you, what does this new community safety and well-being plan mean to you?
Well, thank you. We see community safety and well-being planning as a really crucial planning tool for the Halton Regional Government and my department in particular. We operate a number of programs that work to support communities, social development, and prevention of difficult situations. And while we think we have many, many strengths in the services that we offer, this planning framework allows us to assess the strengths of those services, potentially gaps that exist, so that we can respond effectively.
Okay, thanks. And Nick Milinovich is in charge of or a member of the Regional Community Mobilization Bureau, which is a new service that not only Halton Police Service are doing, but many across the country. And Nick, why don't you, in the context of the Mobilization Bureau, say, what does a community safety and well-being plan mean to you? What do you expect it to add to what you're doing?
It's a great question, thank you. I suppose what I expect or hope for it to do is consolidate some of the efforts of what really is a vibrant community of practice surrounding community wellness. There's a number of service providers that are in the community that are currently engaged in a variety of initiatives and programs designed to support the wellness and safety of our communities. And from the policing perspective, what I hope we can do is incorporate or at least deliver what will be our contribution to an overarching plan to support community wellness and safety.
Okay, Nick, thanks. Norm Taylor is the president of Global Network for Community Safety, and it's an agency he created quite a few years ago. And Norm, before I ask you what it means to you, I want to set a bit of a table here.
Sure.
Over the last 7 or 8 years in the community of Halton, we've had quite an active effort from what I will call the grassroots, started by the Community Foundation of Oakville. But the community foundations across the country have been doing this, and they've been producing these vital signs reports.
Right.
And they've been meant to highlight gaps where people aren't being brought along with the rest of us, where people are not keeping up. And it's done an interesting thing. It's shaped the spending of the Community Foundation on community work. It's also spilled over and influenced our United Way. And over the last 10 years that I've been on Regional Council, we've created and grown to about $1.4 million, a community improvement fund, and that rivals pretty much the amount of money that the United Way puts into the community and that the Community Foundation puts in. What's been missing from that and from what we have started, like other police forces, to do in terms of a community response table, has been an overlaying policy framework. QU, what's your view of how this all worked?
Well, that's a great setup, Mayor, and I appreciate you describing that, because that's kind of where I want to start in my first brief explanation, let's say. We do so many things so well in this country, and we do things very well in our public services. And you know, we have tremendous resources and highly skilled professionals that are doing their part to meet the needs of people across a variety of different, what we call, sectors. What we've recognized increasingly over the last few years is exactly what you just described, is that there are people left behind. There are gaps in those services. There's places and circumstances in which the way the system is designed, it doesn't adequately meet the needs of those people, and unfortunately, they're very often the people who need it most. And to me, a community safety and well-being plan you know, people get this image of a plan, a document, a piece of paper that's going to sit on a shelf, and I think we should stay away from that. Essentially what we're talking about community safety and well-being planning is a process of knitting together all of those resources, all of those talents, all of those capabilities in order to ensure that we apply the system most effectively to those who need it most.
So one of the things that Alex, and Alex, for many years I was on your standing committee because I decided that the only we have 3 standing committees at the region of Halton, and the only one, in my view, that actually helps people is Health and Social Services. That's why I sent myself there. And I'm coming back, by the way. But what we've noticed is that there's like how many different ministries that you have to work with, and how well do they talk to each other?
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Mayor. So my department works very closely with 5 different provincial ministries: Children and Youth Services, Community and Social Services, Ministry of Housing, by way of example. And there are some challenges in terms of us delivering integrated programs when the provincial funding and policy approaches are all highly unique and siloed. So certainly in our conversations with provincial officials, we advocate for a more holistic view, perhaps a community safety and well-being planning view of how we bring services together in a thoughtful way that diminish risk of crime and victimization, but also build healthier and stronger communities. I think we've seen some moderate movement on the part of the provincial government to support us in that way, and that's something we continue to advocate for.
Yeah, I have to say right now, these are not required yet, community safety and well-being plans. It's something that the Ministry of Community Safety and Corrections has told police boards, we're going to make you do that. And I and some other police board members across the province are jumping on it because we see this as a big opportunity to to break those silos and to try to get these things knit together better. And I mean, Nick, you could talk here for a second about how often, I mean, we're the safest community in the country for 8 years, according to StatsCan, and we love that. But our calls for service go up 5 or 6% a year anyway, and only a tiny portion are calls for crime. The rest is
social disorder. It's a great observation in that we continue to experience calls for service, and they escalate year over year by small percentages. And one of the things that we've started to recognize is a large percentage of them can be attributed to things which we term as social disorder issues. And so in responding to those calls and developing, I guess, a plan to address them, we've recognized that it can't just be police developing that plan. We aren't the best positioned agency in a lot of those circumstances to address them. So when we talk about knitting together resources and responses, when we start looking at what we're, or where our resources as a police service are being expended, we really need to look outside of the police service to start addressing some of those issues, because there's so many different partners in the community that are willing to contribute, and to be honest with you, are probably better positioned to.
So at a recent conference, the Deputy Minister for Community Safety and Correctional Services was giving a speech renewing the hint, I need a stronger word than hint, that these are coming. And exercising my infamous cheekiness, I asked, you know, given that this involves many ministries that are outside of the sphere of power of his ministry, I said, are you going to change the name of your ministry to Community Safety and Wellbeing, or are you going to figure out a way to get the ministries to work together? I believe we need a cabinet-level secretariat that will require the ministries to work together on this, so that they match what we're trying to do at the grassroots level, at the top level. And Norm, you've been working with the ministry for a long time. Is there any chance of that?
Well, of course, as you can imagine, I can't speak for the government of Ontario, but I think you're right in terms of reading the currents that are out there. Former Minister of Community Safety, Yasser Naqvi, announced some months ago the introduction of a strategy for a safer Ontario. And much of that strategy is predicated on the concepts that we're talking about here. The recognition that these terms, community safety and well-being, really do need to fit together for the reasons that both Nick and Alex have talked about. That language wasn't that popular or that common a few years ago. And in fact, in Ontario...
Well, well-being is like a brand new phrase. When it arrived, it landed on my desk with an electric vibration to it. I thought, this is what we've always needed.
Yeah. Well, where you see that term is things like the Canadian Index of Well-Being, or in Europe we see well-being indices, and we kind of liked it in some of the discussions in Ontario, some of the early adopters that were starting to move in this direction, because when you talk about wellness, it has other applications. There are people talk about wellness in very different ways. If you talk about policing, it immediately skews the conversation, and people have their own assumptions about when and where and how police get involved. But community safety is a concern to everyone, and when you twin it with well-being, it gets exactly to what these gentlemen were talking about, which is strong families, healthy individuals, strong, safe communities, and an overall sense of well-being in your community. So we began to embrace that language, and I'm taking a long way around here. At this point, the term CSWB, or Community Safety and Wellbeing, is gaining a tremendous amount of traction right across the country.
And it should, because it's actually it's needed. Forget exciting, it's needed.
Yeah, it's very inclusive. Everyone can find their place in it, and I think that's one of the important things that we had to establish. When you start bringing social services together with health, mental health, etc., you have to be very cautious of the language you use so that people can identify their mandate and their mission within that. You mentioned, they're going to, the province is going to, I can't remember the term you used, but demand that communities do these plans. I'd prefer to see that what happens is through the education process and the uptake that we're seeing is that communities, with the kind of leadership like you're showing, come forward and say, we recognize that this just makes sense. We need to do this.
Oh, well, listen, what he said was, he only has the authority to compel police service boards to do things. Right. And so the duty to create a community safety and well-being plan is going to go to the boards. Yeah. I and many other municipal leaders in the Greater Toronto, Greater Toronto area, extending out to Waterloo and to small towns like Stratford, we tend to believe that this belongs at the municipal level. Right. At the municipal level in a single-tier municipality, at the regional level in a two-tier municipality, because the delivery of social services is conducted there. Mm-hmm. I accept what he said about, he only can change the Police Services Act, he can't change the Municipal Act, mm-hmm. and fine, and that's why I have been resorting to campaigning for the government to create a cabinet-level secretariat to deal with this, because if there's two things I would criticize this government on, it is the chaotic delivery of the services and support that they are duty-bound to provide to handle growth and to handle well-being. Yeah. And I don't know if I'm going to live long enough to see them do that, but I'm convinced it's a really good idea.
Well,
now, Nick,
I would absolutely agree with that idea. When you mention creation of a cabinet to support and develop these ideas, one of the things that I've seen in my position in a lot of the committees that I sit on, which are not police-centric, is when you draw people together in a room, they start to identify shared priorities. Mm-hmm. And when they identify those priorities as being shared, then they start to collaborate on how they can better support the achievement of those priorities. And it's a key component to any multi-sectoral or like a community safety and well-being plan in this case.
I think the really good news here, Inspector, is that our departments are working extremely closely together. We have a commitment to the shared principles of community safety and well-being planning. We're well immersed in looking at where our strengths and where our limitations are, and planning in a collaborative way. So I feel like this community is really well positioned to drive forward with more aggressive planning and to again fill in some of those service gaps that may exist that establish that safety and well-being.
There's a Halton spirit that you can see at work in all of this effort that we're doing this year, and actually that goes back to the work that the police service and the board did to get the community response table going. Absolutely. the worry I have is that to do this community response table business, we call on folks that are outside the power of the region even, because those ministries, I mean, we even need the schools to run an effective response table, and none of those ministries are used to answering to us in any way, shape, or form. They only know how to, they really only know how to send orders. And but you're right, both of you. When we get to the grassroots level, like when we talk at the level of community neighborhood associations, people throw away all those dividing lines, and they just want a coordinated, efficient, and effective response that works.
You know, there's a phrase here, Mr. Mayor, that I think it really applies. Most people are familiar with it. Form follows function follows need. You know, Alex talked about the siloing and the structures of bureaucracies. We have those for reasons. We need them for accountability purposes, but they're almost intractable. I mean, the process of changing issues like structure, jurisdiction, budget envelope, these are going to take time. And in my view, and not to be too controversial, but to me that's the lowest common denominator of language that we should be talking about. What you're talking about is mobilizing people on the basis of we see a need, we recognize the need, let's begin to function in different ways. We've been at this for about 8 years since we started down this path out west, and when I look at what we've achieved, I would say that we have moved the yardsticks this far in terms of structure, jurisdiction, those types of form elements. But we've moved it this far in terms of the way people behave, the way people are achieving things, capitalizing on the cooperation that exists, but bringing those other partners in. You'll never find a place in Canada where there's contiguous boundaries between health, education, policing, social services. You won't even find a place where there's continuity in terms of the level of government that is responsible for each of those pieces. In Ontario, we have a lot more that are moved and deployed to the community-based organization level. Other provinces direct those right out of provincial ministries. There is no single blueprint. So what we need to focus on, and that's why I like the CSWB planning concept that Ontario is promoting, is to learn our way towards new structures, to learn our ways towards behaving differently, serving people differently, and then let's figure out, well, if that means we need to change a couple of lines, let's figure out how we do that.
So you have a wonderful circular chart that starts to visualize for people how the police have been on their own track for 7 or 8 years now, working on their own initiative to try to deal with this conundrum where crime is less and less of the work that's coming their way. And maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'll be happy to, and I'll start with what Ontario has adopted as a planning framework, and Halton has adapted and applied within Halton Region over the last couple of years.
Yeah, the province has concentric rings that make me think of a shooting target.
Yeah,
and in Halton, that's not really the ethos that we live with.
Yeah, and I should point out in Sudbury, they have a very similar picture, but theirs is shaped like a nickel. So everyone's got their own way of doing it. But the point is, there are 4 things that we do in public service that have a relationship to community safety and well-being. The one that Nick and his colleagues are most associated with, of course, is emergency response. But in truth, that's a misconception, because we know that 25, maybe as low as 20% of the calls for service are really an emergency response.
Yeah, at the police services, we do all of these things. And one of the reasons for the situation table taking off like it has, and the police boards supporting us, is we don't think we belong in the green and the blue area exclusively. We want help in those areas.
Yeah. And that's the key. That's the whole point of the strategy, is to recognize that, and so let me go to Alex. His organization, people's initial concept might be that they're in the social development business. And true, that's, again, as characterized as response might be for policing. But it's also inaccurate. There's a significant amount of operational work that carries Alex's organization and others like him into targeted prevention, into even response when you're dealing with family matters, etc.
Emergency shelters, income support. We're in that emergency response as well, so we operate in all of these domains.
Yeah, so one of the things this diagram to help people do is recognize, we all got a piece of all of it. The one that we're least familiar with, or that the system was least geared up for, was that amber area there of risk intervention. We have not traditionally, in the last generation, recognized the opportunities for that, and it was through a lot of research, global studies that we did, looking at the social determinants of health and the public health approach that's been taken by the World Health Organization, that we began to see that there are things we can learn about how to do that risk intervention piece.
Now, I've been over the last 10 years of being a mayor, the biggest surprise that I've had is seeing the leadership of police, and I think I first saw it in the chiefs, but I've now been so thoroughly immersed that I see that it's throughout. In this area of well-being and social development, like the famous debate and discussion about the roots of crime, the police are ahead of everybody in this, and I don't know whether it all started in Glasgow or somewhere else. Maybe you do, but this situation table, this community response table, as I call it, is really this risk intervention piece that's grown. And I think in Canada the first was in Prince Albert. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how this, this is an important root of where we are today.
Yeah, I won't spend too much time on it, but just to give people a sense of history here, it would be impossible to identify where it started because elements have been around for 20 years in terms of different communities in the U.S., for example, looking at intervention strategies to direct people away from gang violence or whatever it happens to be. Those then got some publicity, some study, some research. Glasgow did become a very turning point model because the circumstances in Scotland were so dire, and they began doing things that others hadn't done. The situation in Saskatchewan, you talk about Halton or Oakville in particular having the lowest crime severity rates. We're working with communities out there that have crime severity rates that are quite staggering in contrast to what we see in Ontario. And the province was looking for solutions and didn't want to fall into the false assumption that this was a policing or even a crime problem. It began to recognize that it really had to do with marginalized individuals who weren't being served, and they weren't being served by the system overall, including on issues such as poverty and inadequate schooling and inadequate housing. So
the then police chief of Prince Albert came to a national convention of mayors and councillors 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, it would be, yeah.
And gave a short presentation on the progress he was making with this, his adoption and adaption of the Glasgow approach.
Yeah.
I was riveted. I could not believe, first off, I'd never heard a police officer speak that way, and the fact that he had measurable results really got my attention because outcomes management is how you control costs and everything here in this life. So talk more about how this...
So Dale McPhee's a unique individual, and anybody that's heard him speak knows that he does inspire a lot of passion around this. Dale was the chief in Prince Albert at the time that I was working for the province of Saskatchewan. We teamed up around this issue of looking for a whole of government approach. How do you break down silos? How do you get the system to work differently? So he and I took a team of people over to Glasgow in 2010. And it was one of those situations of, when you see it, you know it kind of thing. We saw things happening there that we immediately recognized that if we put some pieces of their experience together and built a made in Canada version, we could get it going. And it's in Dale's character that we got back from Glasgow, I think the 1st of December 2010, and we went live with the model on the 1st of February 2011. Like,
wow.
It was about 8 weeks. and
so that's a man of action.
Absolutely. And that's what's characterized a lot of the progress now over the past several years. We started with the hub table that has now gained a lot of recognition, and in Ontario we're calling those situation tables. But we knew...
And if I have my way, we're going to start calling them response tables.
Response tables, yeah. Prince Edward Island just launched theirs yesterday, and they're calling theirs the bridge. So there you go. I mean, people have different ways of putting a local flavor on things. But the journey we've traveled since, and Deputy Minister Matt Taragian here in Ontario that you mentioned earlier was a former police chief in Waterloo, as you know, and has been an advisor to Dale McPhee and his team in Saskatchewan. So we've been able to recognize opportunities for Ontario and Saskatchewan to learn together, to grow together. Nick and others were involved when some of the very early curiosity started. We formed a group in which Ontario communities could study this. But our vision all along was for something that led towards what we're now calling in Ontario community safety and well-being plans.
And wasn't Waterloo also, besides Prince Albert, it was very early into this as well?
Yeah, I think it was the second adopter in Ontario. Focus Rexdale was the first to launch a table in Ontario. Waterloo, I think Cambridge was perhaps second, or somewhere in that range.
And then from our perspective, Mayor, what we did was obviously try to build and incorporate some of those successes here locally. And what it did for us, and the situation tables really demonstrated for us, was when you start engaging in that multi-sectoral collaboration, you can really approach and begin to address some very, very complex problems. And it was through, if I'm to be honest, those initial stages of development in our situation table that we started to build and begin those relationships that we've since tried to capitalize on and begin to encourage a little bit more so we can start invoking them in what will be a community safety and well-being plan. So it really did a great job of demonstrating the potential there.
Yeah, so we have about a minute left,
okay.
And you have a really great graphic that combines the three activities into one. Do you want to quickly put that up?
Yeah, it may be very helpful for people to see where this has gone. And when I talk about the fact that
But you got to put it up fast or we'll be gone.
Yeah, okay.
They'll just cut us off when we're done.
That's a fairly busy model when you see the whole thing at once, but we wanted to show, this is sort of the long view where we see things heading in Halton region, but I want to zero in. Let me go to the first zoom in if I could. And so what you see here is exactly what Alex started us talking about, was the fact that we need to break down the silos.
But you got to go faster.
Okay, so we've got all these structures and we've got a lot of other initiatives, great work going on.
So
what
let's
we're talking
change
about
to the next one.
Bringing people in. This is the intervention table. Here we have people coming together on a routine basis. It's been operating in Halton now for quite some time.
And change again.
Out of that table, we get data, we get new insights to risk factors. This is the planning piece. This is where you start doing the analytics, and that's what we're going to build forward.
We need a longer show or a bigger boat. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and giving us your attention and learning about this with us today. This is going to be a very big thing for our community over the next year as we create Halton's Made in Halton Community Safety and Wellbeing Plans, plural, and I hope you'll be part of it. Thanks for being with us.